Welcome, everybody, to another edition of the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. As always, I'm your host, Kenneth Gruenfelder, and it's great to have you guys here on this Friday, March 14th. We have a lot to cover on the show today. Before I get into all that, just want to remind you guys, as always, to tip or donate and get your comments recognized. Make sure to hit that super chat button in the chat if you want to see me acknowledge any thought or comment you may have throughout the live broadcast. Makes the show more lively, more entertaining between myself, the host, and you guys, the viewers. We appreciate you guys' viewership each and every day, so any contribution you can make to the show means the world to us as we put out content for you guys each and every day. And also, the other way to help out the show is by going to the link at the bottom of the show segment on the ticker, GSMCPodcast.net. That is GSMCPodcast.net. So let's get into what we are going to discuss for today. So we're going to start off the show. We're going to talk about a team that I really haven't discussed here as the new league year has begun in the NFL, and that's the Dallas Cowboys. We will talk about their offseason, what they've done. They've been a little bit more busier than last year, but we'll talk about the moves that they've made, as well as talking about Demarcus Lawrence and his comments on signing with the Seahawks, and he kind of threw a little jab at the Cowboys, so I wanted to get into that as well. Also, when we go into the second part of the show, we will be talking about so a little bit of college basketball, as Duke's star player Cooper Flagg, who is going to be the number one overall pick in this upcoming NBA draft, got hurt in the Georgia Tech game, in their ACC conference tournament game against Georgia Tech. So we will discuss that. We'll talk about some other NBA stuff as well. We'll talk about the meeting that Mikal Bridges and Tom Thibodeau had, and kind of talk about some of the other games that have happened. We'll talk about the Warriors once again winning last night with Jimmy Butler. They still have only lost one time, so we'll get into that. Then in the third part of the show, we will talk about Russell Wilson. So he met with the Browns yesterday. There was no deal, but he is meeting with the Giants today. So we'll talk about him, with all the Aaron Rodgers stuff, he's been aggressive, Russell Wilson, in trying to find his next team. He's not waiting. So we'll get into that. We'll talk about which team would be a better fit for him. Cleveland would be interesting if he went there, but we'll talk about that in the third part of the show. We'll talk about baseball. We'll get into some headlines. The Tokyo series is coming up. The Dodgers and the Cubs will be playing against each other, so we'll talk about that. We'll also talk about Rafael Devers and him being open to whatever role the Red Sox want to put him in. And also the Braves will be getting some of their players back at some point. Spencer Strider and Ronald Acuna. Just some general baseball segment. And then in the final part of the show, we will continue our schedule or our season overviews. And today we will be talking about the Seattle Seahawks. So let's get into the first topic, which is talking about the Dallas Cowboys and the offseason that they have had so far. So like I said, busier than last year. Not a ton of major moves. They did re-sign some guys, and that's something that they did last season. They did re-sign Cavante Turpin. They also re-signed their punter, Brian Anger. But here are some of the moves that they have made. Oh, and actually also they re-signed Osa Digizua, their defensive tackle. And that's something that they did instead of franchise tagging him. So that was, it was good to get him back. But some of the other moves that they've made, they signed Solomon Thomas, who has been with the 49ers. He spent some time with the Jets. They signed him to a 2-year deal up to $8 million. And he's basically going to be the replacement for Chauncey Golston, who left in free agency to go join a division rival in the Giants. So they brought him in. He turns 30 in December. But this is a guy that they bring in, as a depth piece on the defensive line. They also did add a running back. So there's no Ezekiel Elliott this time. Did they go out and they trade for Tony Pollard? No. Did they go in and get DeMarco Murray out of retirement? No. They signed Javonte Williams to a 1-year, $3.5 million contract. And he basically comes in with Rico Dowdle leaving in free agency. They needed to address that position, and they go out and they add him. Now, are the Cowboys done addressing that position? I don't think so. I think especially when you look at this draft class of running backs, and we've said it over and over again, that's a position that they could definitely go and address. They did also sign a guard in Robert Jones, with Zach Martin retiring, you need to address that position. We'll see if maybe in the draft. They did trade for Kai Elam, and this is from the Bills. He was a first-round draft pick, and he was the guy that the Chiefs kind of picked apart in the championship game. So the Cowboys are hoping that maybe in this new system, change of scenery, he could do better. And they acquired Elam and a 2025 sixth-round pick, and in exchange for a 2025 fifth and a 2026 seventh. So, we'll see change of scenery if, he ends up playing better. But, yeah, that's what we talked about in the championship game was, after, the Bills lost some guys in that game, Christian Benford, after they lost, key guys on the defensive side of the ball, and he had to step in and take on a bigger role. The Chiefs picked him apart. And then they also acquired Kenneth Murray from the Titans, linebacker. Basically, he's going to be Eric Kendricks' replacement, with him out there as a free agent. So you look at the guys that they've brought in, there's not a ton of big names. And I know with one of the Cowboys fans that I pay attention to when it comes to content, he was more optimistic on things. But I think there's a lot of Cowboys fans that are like, what kind of offseason is this? What are we doing here? But we'll see. The Cowboys, their major acquisitions are going to come through the draft. So there are positions that they can address. Running back, I guess offensive line, defensive line maybe. We'll see. But I did want to get into what Demarcus Lawrence had to say. So Demarcus Lawrence, who's been with the Cowboys for a long time, left in free agency to join the Seahawks. And when he was being interviewed, he said, when talking about the Cowboys, he talked about wanting to win a Super Bowl, and he said, I'm not going to win a Super Bowl there, meaning the Seahawks, or meaning the Cowboys. And there was a little bit of Twitter beef between him and Micah Parsons. So this is what he said, calling out Micah Parsons. He said, calling me a clown won't change the fact that I told the truth. Maybe if you spent less time tweeting and more time winning, I wouldn't have left. And then Micah Parsons said, this is what rejection and envy looks like. This is some clown bleep. So there was a little back and forth there. And that is a bit of a problem when it comes to the Cowboys. Because when you have a player come out and say, I'm not going to win a Super Bowl here, that's a bad look. Because the Cowboys, with their brand, they should be a team that a lot of players look at and say, hey, I can win a Super Bowl here. But on the other hand, the Cowboys are not super aggressive in free agency. They're not constantly bringing in free agents. They'll trade for guys, but when it comes to signing big name free agents, they usually don't do that. So you could also look at it from that perspective. But Micah Parsons is a guy that does have his own platform, does a podcast, and the Cowboys right now are in a spot where they've been competitive, except last year. Last year, you could throw that year out the window. But the Cowboys are not known, as of late, for going to the Super Bowl and winning championships. When they were doing that, that was before I was even alive. And they got to get back to that. So Demarcus Lawrence leaving and saying that, I agree with what he said, because the way the Cowboys have been as of late, they aren't winning Super Bowls. But I don't think him going to Seattle means you're going to win one there either. Because they're kind of in a reload period. So, some interesting comments there by Demarcus Lawrence. That he would say that. And, of course, Micah Parsons was going to respond. And that's what happens. We see this all the time. But Dallas has to get back. It was a disappointing year for them last year. We'll see what happens now. Dak Prescott comes back healthy. There's still more that needs to be done with this roster. Micah Parsons is the last guy that they need to work out a deal with and get that done. But there's still more work. You need to add another receiver to this team. We need to add a running back. Offensive line, it's going to look completely different now because now Zach Martin was the last piece of that great offensive line that they had throughout the second part of the mid 2010s into the 2020s. That's a tough replacement. The defense, there's always, they could always add to that as well. But there's still things that they need to address. Right now, to me, they're the third best team in the division. Just like last year. That's what they are. And they better hope the Giants don't find their quarterback, because you would imagine that happens. They find the right quarterback, like the Commanders did with Jaden Daniels, then they're going to be a problem too. Now, you might be saying, that's a bit of a stretch, Kenneth. All right, slow down there. But for now, they are the third best team in the division. And I can't believe I'm saying that because last year I was like, yeah, it's Dallas and Philly at the top. Not so much anymore. It's Philly and it's Washington. And then it's Dallas. But let me know what you guys think about the Cowboys offseason. Again, not a ton of big names. They made moves, but nothing to me that moves the needle, in my opinion. And also let me know what you guys think about what Demarcus Lawrence said, throwing a little jab at the Cowboys. So we are going to take our first break, and then when we come back, we'll talk some basketball. We'll do a college basketball segment. We're going to talk about Cooper Flagg getting hurt, his injury, the impact of that, as well as talking about some other stuff. We'll talk about the meeting between Mikal Bridges and Tom Thibodeau and some of the other NBA action. Also, we'll talk about what's going on in college basketball as well, as it is conference tournament week. So we'll get into all that when we come back from our next break. So with that being said, stick around, and we'll be right back here on the GSMC Sports Podcast.